Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1: A Whisper in Ink. It was one of those late November afternoons when London seemed steeped in melancholy, the streets slick with rain, the air heavy with coal smoke, the daylight already fading before the hour of 4. In his comfortable apartment on Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat before the fire, immaculate as ever, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his moustaches perfectly waxed into symmetrical precision. Upon the small table beside him lay the Times, folded neatly, and a silver tray bearing his tea service. Everything was in its proper place, as was the custom of Hercule Poirot. Yet, despite this order, there was a faint frown upon his brow. He had been reading of political scandals and society divorces, matters which, though entertaining, did not stimulate his little grey cells. Mon Dieu, he murmured, setting down his cup with a sigh. How fatiguing is the world when there is no mystery. The mind of Hercule Poirot, it grows rusty, like a fine instrument left too long unused. At that precise moment, there came a knock upon the door. Poirot straightened immediately. "Enter, if you please." His efficient valet, George, stepped in with an envelope on a salver. "A letter for you, sir. Delivered by hand not 10 minutes ago." The messenger did not wait for a reply. Poirot took it with curiosity. The envelope was of thick cream paper, slightly creased at the corners, the handwriting small, tight, and faintly tremulous. A scent of lavender lingered upon it, old-fashioned, melancholy. He slit it open carefully, as though the act itself might bruise the paper. The letter within was brief. "Monsieur Poirot, I beg of you to come to Greystone Hall in Yorkshire. I am beset by a fear I cannot name, a fear that grows each night. Strange things occur, voices call my name, and shadows move where none should be. I believe soon there will be death. Yours faithfully, Constance Wetherby." Poirot read it twice, his brows knitting more tightly each time. Then, with a soft hum, he rose and went to the window. Outside, the rain fell in steady, slanting sheets, the lamps casting blurred halos of light upon the wet pavements. "Greystone Hall," he murmured. "I have heard that name. An old family, once wealthy, now, what is the word, diminished. And this Lady Constance Wetherby, a widow, I believe." George cleared his throat discreetly. "Will you reply to the letter, sir?" Poirot turned from the window, eyes glinting with interest. "Reply, mon ami? No, no, that will not do. Fear waits for no post. We shall go to Yorkshire tomorrow. Order the tickets for the morning train, and pack the valise. We must not keep the lady waiting in her distress." The next morning was cold and grey as the train sped northward through the damp countryside. Poirot sat composed and upright in his seat, gloved hands resting lightly upon his lap. Opposite him, a portly businessman snored behind a newspaper, while a young woman read a novel, oblivious to the world. Poirot's thoughts, however, were not idle. He studied the letter again, tracing each phrase with his finger. The handwriting trembles, not merely from age, but from agitation. Yet the phrasing is careful, the construction proper. She is a woman of education, of restraint, one who would not write such words lightly. He smiled faintly to himself. And she speaks of voices, of shadows. ABN. The supernatural, perhaps? But no, no, there is always a reason, a purpose, behind the veil. When a lady of standing believes she hears ghosts, it is often a human heart that beats behind the curtain. The journey lasted most of the day. As dusk fell, the train drew into the small station of Greystone Hall, a lonely platform bordered by dark pines. A single carriage awaited, its lanterns glowing dimly through the mist. A solemn man in a heavy coat stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot, sir?" "I'm Carson, Lady Constance's driver." "Her ladyship's most grateful you've come." Poirot inclined his head politely. "The gratitude, I think, may be premature, but we shall see. Lead the way, if you please." The road wound upward through the moor, desolate and windswept. The last light of day faded behind clouds as they climbed higher. Then, from the fog, Greystone Hall emerged, vast, forbidding, its windows glimmering faintly like watchful eyes. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the great door, Poirot felt the peculiar heaviness that clings to old houses, a mixture of history and sorrow. Lady Constance herself awaited him in the entrance hall. She was tall, her silver hair coiled neatly, her face refined yet drawn, as though she carried some great fatigue of the soul. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and tremulous, "I cannot tell you what comfort it brings to see you. You are, I think, my last hope." Poirot bowed gently over her hand. "Madam, hope is a good companion. Tell me, what is it that troubles you so deeply?" She led him to the library, where a fire burned low in a vast stone hearth. The walls were lined with books and portraits, their painted eyes glinting in the half-light. "It began 3 months ago," Lady Constance said, seating herself by the fire. "At first it was small things, footsteps in the corridor, objects moved from their places. Then came the whispering, always at night, always my name. And 2 weeks ago, the portrait of my husband was found slashed to ribbons. No one heard a sound." She paused, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "They say the house is cursed. My late husband, God rest him, believed the Wetherbys were marked by tragedy. But I do not believe in curses, Monsieur Poirot. I believe in malice." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, madam, you speak with reason. Ghosts are convenient things, they conceal the deeds of the living." At that moment, a door opened quietly and a young woman entered. She was perhaps 20, with dark hair and quick, uncertain eyes. "Ah, this is my ward, Iris Grey," said Lady Constance. "Iris, this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot." The girl curtsied slightly, avoiding his gaze. "It's a pleasure, sir," she murmured, but there was tension in her voice, something unsaid behind her polite words. Poirot noted it instantly. "Tell me, mademoiselle," he said lightly, "you, too, have heard these whispers, perhaps?" For a fraction of a second, she hesitated. "Sometimes. I thought I did. But it may only be the wind in the chimneys." Poirot smiled gently. "Ah yes, the wind, it carries many things, does it not?" A clock chimed somewhere in the house, slow, solemn. Lady Constance rose wearily. "You must be tired from your journey, Monsieur Poirot. Carson will show you to your room. We dine at 8. As Poirot followed the butler up the wide, shadowed staircase, he glanced back once at the hall below. Lady Constance stood alone by the fire, her figure small beneath the great portraits of her ancestors. And for an instant, perhaps only a trick of the flickering flames, it seemed to him that one of the painted faces moved. Poirot's brows lifted slightly. "Très intéressant," he murmured. Already, Greystone Hall begins to speak. Chapter 2, The Faces by Firelight. Dinner that evening at Greystone Hall possessed a solemn, almost ritual quality. The long oak table gleamed under the subdued glow of silver candelabra, their flames reflected in the polished surface like rows of watching eyes. The vast dining room, lined with ancestral portraits, seemed to swallow sound. Even the ticking of the great clock in the corner was muffled, as though wary of intruding upon the hush. Hercule Poirot, seated to Lady Constance Wetherby's right, observed his surroundings with quiet precision. Nothing escaped those small, sharp eyes, the strained civility, the faint tremor in a servant's hand, the uneasy glances exchanged across the table. Lady Constance, though graceful, appeared distracted, her gaze often unfocused, as though listening for something beyond the walls. To her left sat Dr. Malcolm Hensley, the family physician, a tall, lean man in his early 50s with silvered hair and a manner that was both attentive and faintly guarded. His conversation was measured, his tone low and grave. Opposite him was Edmund Wetherby, Lady Constance's nephew, handsome, confident, his charm marred only by a certain arrogance that clung to him like expensive cologne. His smile was quick but never reached his eyes. He had the easy assurance of one long accustomed to being indulged. Beside Edmund sat Iris Grey, pale and silent, her dark hair catching the candlelight. She ate little, her eyes fixed upon her plate, though from time to time Poirot noticed her glance nervously toward Lady Constance. Completing the company was Mrs. Dorcas Vale, the long-serving housekeeper. She had the look of one who carried the weight of the house upon her shoulders, a narrow, careworn face and hands that twisted the napkin in anxious repetition. It was, Poirot reflected, a household oppressed by its own silence. "So, Monsieur Poirot," Edmund said at last, breaking the uneasy quiet, "my aunt tells us you are the man who never fails. Quite a formidable reputation." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "Ah, monsieur, reputation is a curious thing, it is often far greater than the man who bears it." Edmund smiled thinly. "Then perhaps we shall hope it is at least half true. My aunt's nerves have been much tried of late, the sort of foolishness one might expect in an old house. Whispers, creaking floors, the usual drama of decaying walls." Lady Constance stiffened. "You may call it foolishness, Edmund, but you have not heard your own name spoken in the dark." He laughed, a little too lightly. "Nor do I intend to. I sleep too soundly for ghost stories." Poirot's gaze flickered between them. "Ah, you are a skeptic, monsieur. And yet, sometimes it is the skeptic who sees most clearly, once the light is turned upon the right shadow." The remark passed almost unnoticed amid the renewed clatter of cutlery, yet Poirot saw how Lady Constance's hand trembled slightly upon her wine glass. When the meal was done, they withdrew to the library. The fire there was large and cheerful, throwing long tongues of light across the dark wood. A decanter of port was set out, and Mrs. Vale, moving with quiet efficiency, drew the heavy curtains against the night and then departed. Poirot, standing before the hearth, regarded the assembled company with mild curiosity. "If I may, Madam Wetherby, might you permit me to ask some little questions? Not as an official inquiry, you understand, but merely to orient the mind." "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Constance said, sinking into a high-backed chair. "You may ask what you please." "Bon. Then, these disturbances you mention, they began 3 months ago, yes? And always they are confined within the house?" "Yes," she said softly. "Always after dark. At first, I thought it imagination, grief perhaps, but then the servants began to whisper, and Edmund himself." "I heard nothing," Edmund interrupted quickly, swirling his port. "Only gossip. This place breeds it." Poirot nodded as if in agreement, though his eyes betrayed keen interest. "And Mademoiselle Iris, you too have heard these sounds?" The girl hesitated, color rising in her cheeks. "Sometimes I thought I heard a voice. But it could be the wind. There's a dreadful echo in these corridors." "Oh the wind, it is a very convenient culprit," Poirot said softly. "But the wind does not slash portraits with a knife, does it?" The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a door banged faintly, the kind of sound that in daylight might be ignored, but which at night seemed to carry meaning. Dr. Hensley spoke at last. "If I may venture an opinion, Monsieur Poirot, I believe Lady Constance's health has been under strain for some time. Grief, isolation, anxiety, these can produce, well, certain impressions. I have urged her to rest, perhaps even a short absence from the hall. Poirot turned his gaze upon him, gentle but direct. Ah, a doctor who diagnoses ghosts as nerves, that is a very English solution. Yet, doctor, you do not yourself seem restful. The hand, it trembles slightly when you speak. Dr. Hensley flushed and placed his glass upon the mantel. A touch of rheumatism, nothing more. Mais oui, murmured Poirot. It afflicts us all in some form. For a few moments, only the ticking of the clock and the hiss of the fire broke the silence. Then Lady Constance rose abruptly. You will think me fanciful, Monsieur Poirot, but there are times when I feel it standing beside me. A presence, unseen but felt. It watches. It waits. Poirot's expression softened. Madam, what you describe is fear, and fear, I think, is the cleverest ghost of all. But courage, that is stronger still. May I see the portrait that was damaged? She nodded. It hangs in the west corridor. Sir Alfred, my late husband. They went together, carrying a lamp through the dimly lit hall. The others followed at a cautious distance. The corridor was long and cold, lined with paintings darkened by age. When they reached the end, Lady Constance lifted the lamp. The portrait was indeed slashed, 3 savage cuts across the painted face. The canvas curled outward, the gashes revealing the black void behind. Poirot leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. Interesting. The cuts are deliberate, not haphazard. Each begins at the same height, the height of the hand of one standing before it. He touched the edge of the canvas delicately. No dust upon the fibers, this was done recently. Within the last fortnight, I think. Lady Constance shivered. The night it happened, I woke to the sound of something heavy falling. When I came down, the portrait was as you see it. Nothing was taken from the corridor? No footprints. None that we found. Poirot looked around slowly. The hall stretched away into shadow. And yet someone moved here, unseen, unheard. That requires not a ghost, madam, but a certain skill. He turned back toward the others. Tell me, who was in the house that night? All of us, Edmund said lightly. But I assure you, none with a knife in hand. Poirot's smile was small, enigmatic. Perhaps not in hand, monsieur, but perhaps in heart. They returned to the library. The fire had burned lower, the shadows lengthening across the carpet. Poirot stood for a long time gazing into the embers, his expression unreadable. Lady Constance, weary, excused herself and retired for the night. One by one the others followed, until only Poirot remained. He drew from his pocket a small notebook and wrote a single line. Voices, fear, inheritance, and the portrait slashed at the eyes. He closed the book and placed it neatly on the table. Greystone Hall, he murmured, you are full of eyes, painted and otherwise. And already, they begin to watch me in return. Chapter 3, The Storm and the Silence. The next morning broke bleak and colourless. A steady drizzle veiled the windows of Greystone Hall, blurring the view of the moors into an indistinct stretch of grey. Poirot, ever precise, was already dressed and seated at breakfast when Lady Constance entered the room. She looked pale, her eyes shadowed by another sleepless night. You did not rest well, madam, he asked gently. No, she confessed. The wind was dreadful. I thought I heard footsteps again, outside my door this time. But when I opened it, there was nothing. Poirot stirred his chocolate thoughtfully. And the servants? They heard nothing, of course. Or so they say. Poirot's eyes flickered toward the window. We shall not dismiss the footsteps so easily, madam. Even a whisper in this house may speak volumes. he spent the morning exploring the corridors. To a casual observer he appeared merely curious. In truth, his gaze missed nothing. He noted the worn patch of carpet near the west corridor, the faint scent of wax near the portrait, and the peculiar draught that seemed to emanate from behind one section of paneling. By noon, the rain had hardened into sleet. The house seemed to draw inward upon itself, the rooms dim, the air thick with the hush that precedes a storm. At luncheon, the mood was subdued. Edmund Wetherby toyed with his glass of claret, exchanging sharp remarks with Dr. Hensley, who replied in curt, clipped tones. Iris sat silent, her eyes fixed on her plate. Only Mrs. Vale attempted conversation, small, nervous fragments about housekeeping matters, which died almost as soon as spoken. Afterwards, Lady Constance asked Poirot to join her in the drawing-room. "You see," she said, as the wind battered the windows, "the servants are frightened. I cannot keep them much longer if this continues. Mrs. Vale herself has begged to be released." "Perhaps," Poirot suggested, "it is not the house that frightens them, but the people within it." Lady Constance gave him a startled look, but he said nothing more. By late afternoon, the storm had broken fully. Rain lashed against the glass, and thunder rolled across the moor. Poirot, ever sensitive to disorder, moved about the library straightening objects with faint irritation. "It is curious," he murmured, "how nature herself conspires to create confusion. Even the lightning, it chooses the most inconvenient moment." At 6:30, Edmund entered, his coat damp from a dash to the stables. "Beastly night," he exclaimed, tossing the garment over a chair. "The horses are restless. Can't say I blame them." Poirot regarded him with mild curiosity. "You have courage, monsieur, to walk in such weather. Courage or boredom? There's nothing else to do in this tomb of a place." He poured himself a drink, glanced at Poirot, and added, "Tell me frankly, do you think my aunt's going mad? These tales of voices and ghosts, utter nonsense, if you ask me." Poirot smiled faintly. "I rarely make diagnoses, Monsieur Wetherby. I observe, and I wait. The truth, it always reveals itself, sooner or later." Edmund laughed, though the sound lacked conviction. "Well, if you discover any spooks, do let me know. I'll have the place exorcised." He finished his drink and left the room whistling under his breath. Poirot watched him go, thoughtful, his fingertips pressed together. The evening passed heavily. At dinner, the storm's fury seemed to rattle even the oldest timbers of the hall. Lightning flashed through the high windows, and each peal of thunder made Iris flinch. Edmund, restless, mocked her nerves, while Lady Constance pleaded for peace. At last, the meal ended, and the household dispersed. Lady Constance retired early, Dr. Hensley excused himself to write in his study, and Iris claimed a headache. Only Edmund lingered for another glass of brandy, his manner half defiant, half weary. Poirot retired soon after. But sleep eluded him. The moaning wind, the creak of the beams, the faint echo of footsteps in the corridor, all conspired to keep him wakeful. He sat by the fire in his room, reading quietly and listening. Shortly before midnight, the storm reached its height. Rain drummed furiously upon the roof, and thunder rolled so close it seemed to shake the very walls. Then, amid the noise, came another sound. A faint crash. Somewhere below. Poirot was on his feet instantly. Taking his small electric torch, he stepped into the corridor. The air was chill, the lamps flickering. From below, a door slammed violently. He moved swiftly down the staircase, his slippered feet soundless on the carpet. The light from his torch swept across portraits, mirrors, and polished banisters until it caught the outline of a tall figure standing near the conservatory doors. "Who is there?" Poirot called. No answer. He advanced, but when he reached the conservatory, it was empty. The door to the garden stood ajar, rain pouring in. With a frown, Poirot closed it and turned his light upon the floor. There were wet footprints, large, heavy, and beside them, something else. A small patch of darkness that glistened oddly in the beam of light. Poirot bent closer. His expression changed. "Ah," he murmured, "so it begins." At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pale, washed-out sky. But within Greystone Hall, there was no calm. Carson, the butler, discovered the body first. He came running into the hall, white-faced and gasping. "It's Mr. Edmund, my lady, he's in the conservatory." Lady Constance's cry echoed through the house. Poirot arrived moments later, his dressing gown buttoned neatly despite the commotion. Edmund Wetherby lay sprawled upon the stone floor beneath the glass dome, one arm flung outward, his head turned sharply to one side. A single blow to the skull had ended his life. Beside him, the shattered remains of a marble vase lay in fragments. Poirot knelt briefly, examining the wound. "It was no accident," he said quietly. "The blow was deliberate and struck from behind." Dr. Hensley, summoned hastily, confirmed the observation. "Instantaneous," he murmured. "Who could have done such a thing?" Poirot did not answer. His eyes travelled around the conservatory, noting every detail, the pattern of wet footprints, the overturned chair, the open window where rain still dripped upon the floor. "Lady Constance," he said at last, "I must ask that no one leaves the house. Until we understand how Monsieur Wetherby met his death, Greystone Hall becomes, alas, a prison." She bowed her head in silent agreement. By mid-morning, Poirot had questioned each member of the household. Mrs. Vale had heard nothing, having retired early. Iris claimed she had been in her room reading. Dr. Hensley said he had been writing in his study until the storm abated. None, it seemed, had seen Edmund after dinner. Yet Poirot, moving quietly through the rooms, found evidence to the contrary. A glass in the library still bore a fresh fingerprint, a match burned halfway down beside it. On the writing desk, a candle had guttered out, leaving a long trail of wax. He stood for a long time gazing at that candle. "The truth," he said softly, "always burns, even when the flame is small." When he returned to the conservatory, he examined once more the scene of death. On the stone near Edmund's hand lay a curious object, a single white petal, torn and crumpled. Poirot lifted it delicately. "A flower, even in death, may speak," he murmured. "And this one, it whispers of deception." That evening, as the household gathered again in the library, the air was thick with dread. Iris sat pale and trembling, Lady Constance wept quietly. Poirot, standing by the fire, addressed them in his calm, measured voice. "My friends, it is now clear, there has been murder in this house. We shall not call upon the police, yet. Instead, I shall ask you each to remain here, where I may observe and think. For I promise you this, before many days pass, the hand that struck in the storm shall be revealed." He looked from face to face, his expression unreadable. "The storm is over," he said softly. "But the silence, it is only beginning." Chapter 4, Beneath the Painted Eyes. The day after Edmund Wetherby's death dawned cold and windless, as though the moors themselves held their breath. The house stood silent, its great chimney sending up pale smoke into a colourless sky. Poirot breakfasted alone, taking only coffee and toast. His appetite, as George would have said, was subdued when the mind was occupied. He sat at the window overlooking the frost-rimmed lawns, his gaze abstracted, his thoughts in methodical motion. There was no doubt in his mind Edmund had been murdered. But by whom, and why? These were questions that required not haste, but patience. When Lady Constance entered, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping, Poirot rose courteously. "You must forgive me, madam," he said softly, "for intruding upon grief with logic. But I must speak frankly. This death, it is no act of chance. She clasped her hands together. I know. I have known it since they found him. He had enemies, Monsieur Poirot, though he would never admit it. He was reckless, cruel, at times. There were quarrels about money, about the estate. Money, Poirot murmured, is often the invisible guest at every English dinner table. Tell me, who stood to gain most from his death? She hesitated. I cannot say. My will leaves the hall to Edmund, or rather, it did. If I die childless, it will go to my ward, Iris. But that is far from my mind now. Poirot inclined his head. Nevertheless, such details must be known. They form the pattern, you see. He noticed the tremor in her hand as she reached for her handkerchief. You believe, then, that one of us, someone in this house, did this? I believe, said Poirot quietly, that the murderer walks these corridors still. Later that morning, Poirot requested permission to examine the west corridor once more, the place where the slashed portrait of Sir Alfred Wetherby hung. Carson, the butler, accompanied him, looking nervous. Begging your pardon, sir, he said, but it fair gives me the chills, that part of the house. None of us go there after dark. Poirot's lips twitched. Courage, my good Carson. The dead, I assure you, are the least dangerous of companions. The corridor was dim and draughty, lit only by a row of narrow windows high upon the wall. The portrait of Sir Alfred hung at the far end, a grim, stern-faced man with cold blue eyes. The slashes across the canvas were still raw and ugly, the torn fabric curling outward like open wounds. Poirot examined it closely, taking a small magnifying glass from his pocket. Observe, he said, half to himself. The knife was sharp, the cut precise. But what is this? The edges of the canvas, see how they bend inward here, outward there. Someone has removed something from behind. Carson looked startled. You mean, there's space behind the painting? Exactly. Help me lift it down, if you please. Together they eased the heavy frame from its hooks. Behind it, as Poirot had guessed, was a narrow recess set into the wall, dusty and cobwebbed, but empty save for a small scrap of fabric caught on a nail. Poirot lifted it delicately. It was a fragment of silk, fine, pale grey, and faintly scented with lavender. Lady Constance, he murmured. Her dressing gown, perhaps. But how curious that it should find its way here. He replaced the painting and dusted his hands. Merci, Carson. You may return to your duties. I shall continue my little promenade alone. He walked the corridor slowly, pausing before each portrait. Generations of Wetherbys gazed down at him from darkened frames, faces proud, sorrowful, cruel. So much lineage, he murmured, and yet so little happiness. At the far end of the passage, a faint sound made him pause. A whisper, perhaps, or merely the sigh of the wind through a hidden vent. But when he turned, a shadow slipped out of sight around the corner. Mademoiselle Iris, he called softly. The young woman emerged from a side door, her face pale. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I did not mean to startle you. On the contrary, he said kindly, you startle nothing, except my curiosity. You come from that small door, may I ask where it leads? To the music room, she said. It hasn't been used in years. I often go there to read, it's quiet. Indeed, said Poirot, studying her closely. You read in the cold and dust? That is dedication. Or perhaps, privacy. She bit her lip, saying nothing. Poirot's voice softened. Mademoiselle, forgive me if I am direct, but you are afraid. Of whom? Her eyes filled with tears. You mustn't ask me that. Please. I can't. Can't, or won't. I don't know anything. I only heard voices that night. Arguing. I think it was Edmund and she stopped abruptly, pressing a hand to her mouth. And? Poirot prompted gently. Please, she whispered, not yet. Before he could reply, she fled down the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the stone. Poirot watched her go, thoughtful. The fear, he murmured, it grows. It infects this house like damp upon a wall. By afternoon, the clouds had gathered again, throwing the house into shadow. Poirot took the opportunity to speak privately with Dr. Hensley, whom he found in his study, writing at his desk. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, the doctor said, looking up with a strained smile. You come with questions, I suppose. Poirot bowed slightly. Always. You were among the last to see Monsieur Wetherby alive. I believe so. He came to the study briefly after dinner to borrow a paper knife. He said he meant to open a parcel. That was the last I saw of him. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And you did not hear anything later, the crash, the noise from the conservatory? No. The storm drowned everything. I was writing until nearly 2. Indeed. And this paper knife, did he return it? The doctor hesitated. I don't recall. Poirot inclined his head, smiling faintly. Ah, memory. It is a thing most treacherous, n'est-ce pas? When he left the study, Poirot's expression was thoughtful. A paper knife, he murmured. Or perhaps, a weapon. That evening, the household gathered in the drawing room at Poirot's request. The atmosphere was tense, expectant. Miss Amos, he began, already we have the shape of things, though not yet their meaning. Consider, a portrait slashed, a secret recess, a fragment of silk, and a death most brutal. These are not the works of madness, but of calculation. Lady Constance looked up sharply. You mean it was planned? Poirot spread his hands. Every murder, madam, is planned, even when it is born of passion. The mind of the killer prepares itself, whether in days or in moments. Iris sat with folded hands, her face pale in the firelight. Dr. Hensley stood apart, his eyes fixed on the window. Mrs. Vale twisted her handkerchief nervously. Poirot's voice softened. One of you knows more than you have said. But I am patient. The little grey cells, they work best when others sleep. He glanced toward the door. Tonight, I think, I shall take a small walk before retiring. There is something in this house that wishes to be found. Later, when the lights were dim and the house lay still, Poirot moved once more down the west corridor. His lamp cast narrow beams upon the floorboards. He paused before the portrait of Sir Alfred. Behind him, faint as breath, came a sound, a whisper, almost a sigh. Poirot turned sharply. The corridor was empty. And yet, upon the floor just beyond the portrait, gleamed a small drop of wax, fresh, white, and still warm. He smiled slowly. Ah, he said under his breath, the one who waits in darkness leaves always a trace. Even the candle tells its story. He pocketed the fragment delicately and turned back toward his room. The eyes of the portrait seemed to follow him as he went, and though the wind outside was still, the house itself seemed to whisper. Soon, said Poirot softly, very soon, we shall see who hides beneath the painted eyes. Chapter 5, Ashes and Reflections. The next morning dawned with a thin veil of mist that clung to the grounds of Greystone Hall like a shroud. The air inside the house was unnaturally still, carrying the faint scent of extinguished candles and wood smoke. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Poirot descended to breakfast at his usual unhurried pace, immaculately dressed and perfectly composed. He found Lady Constance already seated, pale and anxious. The table, once neatly laid, bore signs of uneaten food and a sense of quiet panic. Mrs. Vale hovered in the doorway, her apron askew, her hands twisting the corner of a napkin. "Madam," Poirot said softly, "you have the appearance of one who has spent the night with fear as her companion." Lady Constance pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "She's gone, Monsieur Poirot. Iris, she's disappeared." "Disappeared?" His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "At what hour was she last seen?" "Last night, after dinner. She said she was retiring early. But her bed has not been slept in, her room untouched. The servants have searched the house." Poirot's tone grew quiet, firm. "And outside?" "The grounds are being searched now. Dr. Hensley and Carson have gone towards the stables." Poirot took a sip of his coffee. "Ah. So the drama unfolds further. The murderer, it seems, is not content with one death alone. He excused himself and went immediately to Iris's room. The small chamber overlooked the east gardens. A faint trace of perfume, violet and something lighter, still lingered in the air. On the dressing table stood an open book, face down, and beside it a small silver brooch shaped like a swan. Poirot examined the brooch carefully. "It is bent," he murmured. "As though pulled, not dropped." He noted too that the window latch was unfastened, though the outside led only to a sheer drop into thick ivy. There were no footprints on the sill, no sign of forced entry. Yet something else caught his eye, on the carpet beneath the window, a single footprint in fine grey ash. Poirot knelt, examining it with a small magnifying lens. "Ash, from a fireplace," he whispered. "But whose fireplace?" "Not hers, there is none here." He rose and looked around once more, his sharp eyes taking in every angle, every imperfection. Then he left the room as carefully as he had entered. Downstairs, Lady Constance waited in the drawing-room, wringing her hands. The fire had burned low, leaving behind a bed of glowing embers. Poirot stood beside the hearth, gazing thoughtfully at the ashes. "Lady Constance," he said, "you told me that Sir Alfred's portrait was slashed only a week ago. Since then, strange noises, a feeling of dread, and now 2 tragedies. I begin to think the disturbances were not supernatural, but psychological, engineered, perhaps, to unnerve you." She turned to him, startled. "Engineered? But by whom?" "By one who understands fear, and the power of suggestion. The ghost, madam, was only ever a mask." Her lips trembled. "But why torment me?" "Because you are the mistress of this house. And perhaps because you will decide who shall inherit it." She went pale. "You cannot mean—" Poirot held up a hand. "I mean only that motive, in such cases, wears many disguises." At that moment, the door opened and Dr. Hensley entered, his expression grim. "We found nothing," he said. "No sign of the girl in the gardens or the woods. If she's gone, she left on foot, and in that fog, she could not have gone far." Poirot studied him closely. "You look troubled, Doctor." Hensley hesitated. "I am." Edmund's death unsettled her deeply. "I warned Lady Constance she should not be left alone last night." "You warned her," Poirot said slowly, "but you did not act." "I had no reason to believe she'd come to harm." Poirot nodded. "No reason, perhaps, but knowledge." The doctor's jaw tightened. "If you're implying I had anything to do with her disappearance, you're mistaken." Poirot inclined his head mildly. "I imply nothing, Doctor. I merely listen to words and to silences." At noon, Poirot requested that the fire in the drawing-room be extinguished. Carson obeyed, though he seemed puzzled. Poirot waited until the ashes cooled, then took a small metal probe from his pocket and began gently sifting through the soot. Lady Constance watched him, aghast. Monsieur Poirot, surely this is unnecessary. Everything, madam, is necessary, he replied, his eyes sharp. Even the ashes speak. His probe struck something hard. He lifted it out, a fragment of metal, small and blackened, yet unmistakable. It was the broken clasp of a chain, scorched but still bearing traces of enamel. Bon, he murmured. We progress. He cleaned the fragment carefully and handed it to Lady Constance. Do you recognize this? She examined it, her face tightening. Yes. It belonged to Edmund. He wore it on his watch chain. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Indeed. And now it lies among the ashes of your drawing-room fire. Curious, n'est-ce pas? The afternoon waned into a dull, colourless light. Poirot retired to the library, asking that he not be disturbed. He spent several hours alone, walking from shelf to shelf, pausing now and then to study his reflection in the polished glass of the bookcases. The truth, he said softly to himself, hides not only in what is seen, but in what is reflected. When he emerged, his manner was calm, almost cheerful. He requested tea to be brought to the small morning room overlooking the gardens. As Mrs. Vale served him, Poirot said casually, "You have been long in Lady Constance's service, madam." 30 years, sir, she said proudly, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. I came here as a girl. And in all those years, Poirot continued, you have seen much joy, sorrow, perhaps secrets. She froze, the teapot trembling in her hand. Secrets, sir? I wouldn't know about such things. None, he said pleasantly. You are discreet, I am sure. Yet you were fond of Mademoiselle Iris, were you not? Her eyes flickered. She was kind to me. Like a daughter. Poirot looked at her keenly. Then you must hope she returns soon, for her sake, and for yours. She turned away abruptly, setting the teapot down with unnecessary force. Excuse me, sir, she muttered, and hurried out. Poirot sipped his tea thoughtfully. Ah, he murmured, a loyal heart, and a guilty conscience. Always, they make a dangerous combination. Evening descended once more over the moors, grey and heavy. The mist thickened, curling against the windows like pale smoke. Poirot stood by the window of the library, watching as a lantern's faint glow moved near the stables, Dr. Hensley, returning from another futile search. Lady Constance joined him, wrapped in a shawl. There's still no sign of her. Monsieur Poirot, I'm frightened. This house, it feels cursed. He turned to her, his expression softening. No, madam. It is not cursed. It is merely human. Human. Yes. Every shadow here is cast by a living hand. And before long, I shall name that hand. He gestured toward the fire, where its flickering light played upon the glass-fronted cabinets. Do you see, Lady Constance, how the flame dances, and the reflection changes with each flicker? So too with truth, it shifts, until suddenly, it is clear. She stared at him. You mean you already know? Not all, Poirot said quietly. But enough to see the pattern beginning to form. We have ashes, we have reflections, and both tell me that deceit burns brightest when love and fear walk side by side. He looked out into the fog once more. Mademoiselle Iris has not fled far, I think. The one who hides her is near, so near that even now, they hear us speak. His voice dropped to a whisper. Tonight, I shall wait. And when the reflection shows its true face, Poirot will act. Chapter 6, The Candle and the Key. That night, the mist thickened into a suffocating veil. It wrapped around Greystone Hall until even the chimneys seemed to float like grey ghosts above the moor. Within, the house slept uneasily. Doors creaked without wind, and distant floorboards groaned like sighs. In the library, Hercule Poirot sat alone by the dying fire. The small clock on the mantel ticked softly. Every few minutes, he consulted his pocket watch, his head tilted slightly, eyes gleaming with thought. Before him, on the table, lay 3 objects: the bent swan brooch, the scorched watch chain fragment, and a stub of white candle sealed with a droplet of fresh wax, the one he had found near Sir Alfred's portrait. 3 little witnesses, he murmured. One speaks of love, one of death, and one of deception. He leaned back, fingers steepled. And all point, perhaps, to the same hand. Shortly before midnight, Poirot rose and moved silently through the corridor. He carried only a single candle in a brass holder, its light trembling along the walls. Shadows of ancestors stared down at him from their frames, their painted eyes cold and unblinking. He paused before the portrait of Sir Alfred once more. The air here felt different, chill, expectant. Setting down the candle, he pressed gently along the paneling until a faint click rewarded him. A section of wall swung inward with a whisper of dust. Behind it yawned a narrow passage, black as pitch. Poirot's candle flame quivered, casting gold upon the damp stones. He hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The passage descended steeply, its air heavy with age. He followed it until it turned sharply and ended in a small wooden door, locked and half-rotted. From behind it came the faintest sound, a movement, perhaps, or breath. Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was soft but firm. "You need not fear, mademoiselle. It is only I, Hercule Poirot." There was a startled gasp, then silence. "I shall not harm you," he continued gently. "But it is cold here, and unkind. You would do better to speak to me than to the dark." A pause, then the sound of a latch turning. The door creaked open. Inside was a small chamber, windowless and bare but for a narrow cot and a broken chair. Huddled in the corner, her face pale in the candlelight, was Iris. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered. How did you find me?" Poirot placed the candle on the chair and gave a small, approving nod. "By using the only weapon I possess, mademoiselle, the little grey cells. You are quite unharmed." She nodded weakly. "Yes. I've been here since last night. I was afraid." "Of whom?" She looked down, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "I can't, if I tell you, they'll kill me." Poirot's voice softened further. "No one will harm you now. Speak, and you shall have my protection." Her breath came unevenly. "It was Dr. Hensley. I saw him, he struck Edmund. They were arguing in the conservatory. Edmund said he knew something about the portrait, about the will. Then the doctor, he had something in his hand, shining. I ran before he saw me." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained calm. "And afterward? Did you confront him?" "I tried. I told him I would tell Lady Constance. But he said no one would believe me. Then last night he came to my room. He said if I valued my life I'd keep silent. I escaped through the corridor and found this passage. I've been hiding here since." Poirot regarded her gravely. "You are brave, mademoiselle. But you have done well to trust me now." He offered his hand. "Come, the time for hiding is over." They returned to the corridor in silence. The candle flickered wildly as they emerged, and for a moment Poirot thought he saw movement at the far end, a flash of white, a shadow slipping away. "Quickly," he murmured. "To the library." Once inside, Poirot closed the door and drew the bolt. Iris sank into a chair, trembling. He poured her a small measure of brandy from the decanter. "Drink," he said kindly. "It will steady you." As she obeyed, he moved to the writing desk and took up the telephone, intending to summon Carson. But before he could lift the receiver, the door handle rattled sharply. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah," he murmured, "we are not alone." "Who's there?" he called. The door ceased trembling. Silence followed, thick and unnatural. Poirot crossed the room swiftly and drew the bolt aside. The corridor beyond was empty. Only a faint smell lingered in the air, a sharp, medicinal scent. "Ether," Poirot whispered. So, the doctor was listening. An hour later, as dawn began to pale the sky, Poirot gathered the household in the great hall. Lady Constance sat by the fire, her face drawn. Dr. Hensley stood stiffly by the window, his expression composed but wary. Mrs. Vale wrung her hands, while Carson hovered uncertainly in the background. Iris, pale but resolute, stood at Poirot's side. "Miss Amos," Poirot began, his voice calm yet commanding, "it is time we dispelled the fog that lies over Greystone Hall, not the fog of the moor, but that which clouds the truth." Dr. Hensley's eyes flashed. "If this is some accusation—" "Patience, doctor," said Poirot. "We shall let the evidence speak." He turned toward Lady Constance. "You spoke of the portrait of Sir Alfred. It was slashed, you thought, by some vengeful hand. But I tell you, it was done to conceal something, not to destroy." From his pocket he withdrew a small, yellowed envelope. "Behind the portrait, I found this, wedged in the recess. It contains a letter, written many years ago, altering your late husband's will. The estate was to pass not to Edmund, but to Iris." A gasp went up around the room. Lady Constance's hand flew to her mouth. Poirot continued, "Edmund discovered this change only recently. He confronted Dr. Hensley, who, as executor of the old will, had concealed it. There was an argument, a blow, and Edmund died." Dr. Hensley's face hardened. "That is absurd. You have no proof." Poirot smiled gently. "But I have, doctor. The fragment of your watch chain, found in the ashes of the drawing-room fire. You burned the altered will after Edmund's death, did you not? But a small piece remained. You were careless." The doctor's composure faltered. "This is nonsense." "None," said Poirot quietly. "It is truth. You burned the letter after Iris discovered you. When she fled, you followed her. But she was clever, she found the passage first." Dr. Hensley's face went ashen. "You can't prove." Poirot lifted a small object from his pocket, the stub of candle, with its faintly bent wick. "This was found near the portrait. Its wax bears the print of your thumb. You used it when you hid the letter." A long silence fell. Then, in a hoarse voice, Hensley said, "He would have ruined everything. The estate was drowning in debt. I meant to protect Lady Constance. By killing her heir." Poirot asked softly, "Ah, mon ami, you played the Good Samaritan, but your heart was filled with pride. You believed yourself savior and judge. That, always, is the beginning of crime." The doctor sagged, his shoulders bowed. "I didn't mean to kill him, it was an accident. He fell." "But when the girl saw—" Poirot raised a hand. "No more. The police will come soon. For now, I ask only that you make no further pretense." Hensley looked toward Lady Constance, his expression suddenly hollow. "I loved this house. I loved you." She turned away, trembling. "You destroyed everything." As the doctor was led away by Carson and another servant, the first rays of sunlight broke across the moor, flooding the hall with pale gold. Poirot, standing near the hearth, adjusted his cuffs with quiet satisfaction. Lady Constance approached him. "Monsieur Poirot, I shall never forget what you have done." He smiled faintly. "You are kind, Madam. But I have done only what must be done, to restore order from chaos. An Iris? She will inherit, as her guardian intended. And perhaps, find peace. Iris, standing by the window, looked out into the mist that was already lifting. It feels as though the house can breathe again, she said softly. Poirot bowed his head. Yes, mademoiselle. The ghosts have departed, not of the dead, but of guilt and silence. He turned toward the great doors of the hall. Come, it is morning. And Hercule Poirot does not linger where the truth has already spoken. Chapter 7, The Shadows Recalled. For 2 days after Dr. Hensley's confession, peace seemed to return to Greystone Hall. The mist lifted, the air grew clear, and even the servants, who had moved about in silence and dread, began to speak again in normal tones. The great house exhaled, as though released from the grip of something malign. Lady Constance retired early each night, seeking rest after long weeks of strain. Iris spent her days walking the grounds, her colour slowly returning. The police had taken Hensley to London, and the newspapers, respectful but hungry, carried brief columns about the Greystone tragedy. Only Hercule Poirot remained uneasy. He was, as always, fastidious, impeccably dressed, serene in manner, but those who knew him would have seen the faint crease between his brows as he paced the drawing-room, hands clasped behind his back. It was not vanity that troubled him, Poirot was too sure of his own methods for that. No, it was something smaller, something that refused to fit, like a speck of dust upon a mirror that would otherwise reflect perfection. The case, he murmured to himself, is solved. OUI. The man confesses. The evidence is plain. Yet, he stopped before the window, looking out at the lawns washed pale by morning frost. There is something out of symmetry. He turned suddenly. And when the symmetry is broken, always, there is a lie. That afternoon, Poirot sought out Iris. He found her by the rose garden, where the stems stood bare and sharp against the fading grass. She was feeding crumbs to a robin that hopped boldly near her hand. Mademoiselle, he said gently, you are more calm today. Yes, Monsieur Poirot, she said, smiling faintly. It feels as though a weight has lifted. And yet, he said softly, your eyes tell me you still dream of that night. She hesitated. Sometimes. I see the conservatory, the thunder, Edmund lying there. I hear the crash of glass. But it's fading now. Bon. Poirot nodded approvingly. The mind heals, but slowly. Still, I would ask you one small question, purely for the satisfaction of my little grey cells. Yes? When you saw the quarrel between Dr. Hensley and Monsieur Wetherby, you said he struck with something that shone. Describe it again, if you please. She frowned slightly. I thought it was a knife. But the light was strange. It could have been anything metal, a paper knife perhaps. Poirot tilted his head. Perhaps. And the blow, it was struck with force. Yes. I think so. But I turned away almost at once. Ah. Poirot smiled, but there was thought behind his eyes. You turned away, and you assumed. He left her there, her face troubled, and returned to the house. In the library, Poirot found Lady Constance seated by the fire, sorting through papers. You work still, madam, he said. Even now? She smiled wearily. There is so much to be done. The solicitors write daily. They insist upon inventories, valuations, oh, it never ends. Poirot seated himself opposite her. And you have had no more disturbances? No voices in the night? She gave a short laugh. No ghosts, Monsieur Poirot. Thanks to you. Ah, but the ghosts of the living, he said softly. They are more persistent. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a document. "What do you mean?" Poirot leaned forward. "The will, madam." The letter concealed behind the portrait, it was genuine, yes. "But tell me, who placed it there?" "Why, my late husband, of course." "Are you certain?" She blinked. "Who else could have?" "Who indeed," said Poirot quietly. "And yet, I find myself wondering why a man would hide a legal document behind a painting rather than deposit it with his solicitor." She said nothing. Her lips pressed together. Poirot continued, "And there is another small thing. When I discovered the recess, there was dust everywhere, dust of years. But upon the nail that held the silk fragment, the dust was disturbed. Recently. You see, madam, the truth often clings to the smallest particle." Lady Constance's gaze dropped. "What are you suggesting?" "That the letter," Poirot said softly, "was placed there not years ago, but weeks ago." She stared at him, color draining from her face. "That's impossible." I knew nothing of it." Poirot rose. "Perhaps. But someone did. Someone clever enough to know that when the portrait was found slashed, suspicion would fall where it was most convenient." That evening, Poirot dined alone in the small breakfast room. Carson served him in silence, but as he withdrew, Poirot said casually, "You are a faithful servant, my good Carson. You have been with Lady Constance for many years." "Since before her marriage, sir." "And before that, you served her father, Sir Alfred." The butler hesitated. "Yes, sir. For a time." Poirot looked up from his plate. "A long devotion. You have seen much, births, deaths, secrets, perhaps." Carson stiffened. "I beg your pardon, sir." Poirot smiled faintly. "I beg yours. But I am curious. Did Sir Alfred ever speak of changing his will before his death?" Carson's eyes flickered. "He did, sir. Once. He said young Edmund was not fit to manage the estate. But nothing came of it, as far as I knew." "Merci," said Poirot. "You have been most helpful." When the butler had gone, Poirot sat back, tapping his fingers lightly upon the table. "Ah," he murmured. "Now the pattern begins to restore itself." Later, he returned to the west corridor with a lantern. The portraits loomed dark against the walls, their varnished faces catching fragments of light. He stopped before the one nearest Sir Alfred's, a portrait of Lady Constance as a young woman. Her painted eyes seemed to follow him. He lifted the lantern closer and examined the frame. There, faint but unmistakable, was a smudge of candle wax, white, like that found before. He smiled. "So," he whispered, "there were two candles, not one." He traced his finger along the bottom of the frame and felt the edge of a hidden compartment. Within lay a small brass key, tarnished but still serviceable. "The candle and the key," he said softly. "Always they go together." At dawn, Poirot summoned the household once more to the drawing room. His expression was grave but calm. "My friends," he began, "you believed the case of Greystone Hall was finished. But I tell you, it is not. Dr. Hensley's confession was true only in part. He struck the blow, yes, but not with intent to kill. He was provoked, misled, and manipulated." Lady Constance rose, pale and trembling. "This is madness." "None, madam. It is order." Poirot produced the small brass key. "This, I found hidden in your portrait. It opens the desk in your morning room, the one that was said to contain your late husband's papers." Her lips parted in shock. How did you know?" Poirot's voice hardened slightly. "Because the dust on the lock was new. Someone had opened it recently. Inside, I found 2 drafts of the same will, one naming Edmund, one naming Iris. Both written by Sir Alfred, but neither signed. The letter behind the portrait was forged, madam. And the ink, when tested, is not 15 years old, but barely 3 weeks. There was a long silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lady Constance said, "You cannot prove." Poirot raised a hand. "The silk fragment, the lavender scent, the disturbed dust, they prove enough. It was you who placed the letter behind the portrait to disinherit your nephew and secure the estate for your ward, believing her pliant, grateful, and easily managed. You sought to frame Edmund as unworthy. But Hensley, discovering your secret, turned it to his own advantage, and in doing so, doomed himself." Her hand shook violently. "I only wanted peace. The hall was mine by right, my husband meant it so." Poirot's voice was gentle now. "Madam, greed often wears the face of reason. You deceived yourself as much as others. And yet, it was your lie that began all this, the lie that brought murder to your door." She sank into a chair, weeping softly. Iris stood frozen, disbelief in her eyes. Poirot bowed his head slightly. "I am sorry, mademoiselle. But truth, it is like dawn, it spares no shadow." Outside, the morning sun rose cold and pale over the moor. Poirot stood by the window, gazing out. "The shadows have been recalled," he said quietly to himself. "Now only one thing remains, to decide whether justice is best served by law or by mercy." He turned, his reflection mirrored faintly in the glass. And that, Hercule Poirot must consider most carefully. Chapter 8, The Final Light. The evening of the revelation arrived with the sky streaked in violet and gold, the last vestiges of the sun casting long shadows across Greystone Hall. The air held a gentle chill, but inside, the great drawing-room glowed warmly. Candles flickered in polished sconces, sending a soft light upon the assembled household. Hercule Poirot stood near the fireplace, impeccably dressed in his dark suit, a small smile beneath his waxed moustache. Iris and Lady Constance sat close together on the settee, their hands clasped tightly. Carson and Mrs. Vale hovered discreetly near the edges of the room, while Dr. Hensley, under polite constraint, remained near the doorway, his expression rigid and unreadable. Poirot cleared his throat gently. "Miss Amos, it is time to shed the final light upon the events that have brought tragedy and fear to Greystone Hall." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. "Many believe that murder is sudden, a lightning strike that leaves chaos in its wake. But no. Murder is a story, a narrative written by the hand of intention. And every story has clues, small, often invisible, yet unmistakable to those who know how to see." Poirot turned toward the painting of Sir Alfred Wetherby. "Let us begin here, with the portrait." Slashed as it was, it seemed only an act of vandalism, perhaps the work of a man in anger or the ravings of a disturbed mind. But look closely, and you see a deliberate concealment. A recess, a letter hidden, a fragment of silk. These were the first whispers of the story. He lifted the bent swan brooch in his hand. This fragment, small, yet eloquent, was carried through the house, unnoticed, a witness of presence and intent. It led me to ask, who had accessed the portrait recently? Who sought to manipulate the will? Dr. Hensley shifted uncomfortably, but Poirot continued calmly. The fragment of the watch chain, found among the ashes of the drawing-room fire, confirmed my suspicion: someone burned evidence. And the candle stub, with its fresh wax impressions, even the hand that hid the documents leaves a trace when it acts in haste. Lady Constance clutched her shawl tightly. Poirot's gaze softened momentarily as he addressed her. "Madam, it is not ill will that drives us to action, but fear of loss, fear of insignificance, fear of change. You desired to protect the estate, to control its destiny, yet your plan, clever though it was, became entangled with forces you could not anticipate. Poirot's eyes swept the room, settling finally on Iris. And Mademoiselle Iris, the innocent, also it seemed. Yet she, too, became part of the narrative, though unwittingly. Her keen eyes, her courage in fleeing, revealed a truth to me that the others could not perceive. By hiding, she forced the actions of Dr. Hensley into the open, and so saved herself, and indirectly, the household from further chaos. Poirot's voice lowered, almost conspiratorially. "Hensley, you struck Edmund Wetherby." "Yes, that is true. But it was not a premeditated murder. You acted in the heat of fear, upon discovery of the concealed will and your own complicity in its concealment." Dr. Hensley's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but Poirot held up a slender finger. "Do not interrupt, mon ami. The truth is sometimes more exacting than accusation. You did not intend to kill, yet death came. And in the aftermath, you sought to control and manipulate, to coerce a young girl into silence. These actions, though cunning, left traces. Wax on the portrait, footprints in ash, a disturbed desk, fragments of silk and metal, all spoke to me, if one knew how to listen." Poirot's gaze shifted toward Lady Constance again. "And you, madam, you orchestrated the concealment of documents, intending to favor one heir over another. Yet even in your cleverness, there were errors. The dust was fresh, the fragment of silk, your fragrance. Every human act, however small, betrays the hand that moves it. The little grey cells, as I call them, are patient observers of these betrayals." The room remained silent. Even Iris's hands, clasped together in her lap, ceased their trembling. Poirot smiled faintly, almost kindly. "But," he said, lifting a finger with dramatic precision, "there was one final deception, subtle, hidden beneath all others. The letter behind the portrait, apparently the instrument of disinheritance, it was forged. Someone had hoped to frame Edmund, perhaps to push Hensley toward action. Someone sought to manipulate the sequence of events, to engineer fear and chaos for their own benefit." He let the words hang in the warm, candlelit room. Dr. Hensley's face went pale, and he opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot continued with calm authority. "Yes, Doctor. You were clever. But cleverness cannot erase the trace of human fallibility. Your attempt to influence events, to protect your own reputation and control outcomes, resulted in consequences that spiraled beyond your command. And it was only the presence of our young lady here, Iris, that disrupted your scheme." Poirot paused, then turned slowly toward Lady Constance. "And madam, the ultimate truth rests not with actions alone, but with intention. You sought to manipulate, yet your intention was, at heart, to preserve the hall and those you loved. It is not evil, merely human." Lady Constance's eyes filled with tears. She nodded faintly, as though accepting a truth she had long denied. Poirot then lifted the small brass key he had discovered hidden behind her portrait. "This key," he said, opened the morning room desk, where another clue awaited. 2 drafts of the same will, one naming Edmund, one naming Iris, both unsigned. The forged letter had been intended to replace them. But the attempt failed, as we now see. Fate has a way of revealing itself, even in the presence of deceit. He placed the key upon the mantelpiece. "The estate shall go to Iris, as Sir Alfred intended. Edmund's memory, though marred by tragedy, will endure. And Dr. Hensley, having confessed, shall answer for his unintended crime through law, tempered, perhaps, with the knowledge of the complexities that drove him to action." A long silence filled the room. Outside, the moor lay quiet beneath a clear sky. Poirot stepped to the window, looking out over the frost-glimmering lawns. The shadows have departed, leaving only light, the light of truth. And now, with the dawn, all things may be restored. Iris approached him, her eyes bright but serious. Monsieur Poirot, you have brought peace to the hall, but how did you see all of this so clearly? Poirot smiled faintly. Mademoiselle, it is the little grey cells that see what the eyes miss. Observation, deduction, patience, these are the instruments of understanding. And above all, attention to human nature. Fear, pride, love, ambition, these are motives as clear as any fingerprint. She nodded slowly. And the candle, the wax, the key, they were all pieces of the puzzle. OUI. Even the smallest piece can illuminate the whole, he said, lifting the candle stub with care. Never underestimate the importance of minor details. They tell the story the human mind may wish to conceal. Lady Constance, watching the exchange, finally spoke. Monsieur Poirot, you have given us justice and understanding both. I cannot thank you enough. Poirot inclined his head. Madam, gratitude is unnecessary. One seeks only order. And when order is restored, the heart may rest. This, too, is its own reward. The household slowly dispersed. Carson moved to attend to preparations for breakfast, Mrs. Vale busied herself with tidying, and Iris wandered to the gardens, sunlight glimmering on the frost. Poirot remained in the drawing-room for a moment, gazing at the portraits of the Wetherbys on the walls. They stare always, yet now they see truth, he murmured to himself. And all things are made right, not by force, but by careful thought and patience. He stepped back, straightening his coat, and took up his walking stick. Outside, the moor stretched wide beneath a morning sun that promised warmth. Greystone Hall, once a house of fear and shadows, now stood in calm and quiet dignity. And Hercule Poirot, master of deduction and guardian of the little grey cells, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The mystery is ended, he said softly. The final light has shone. And peace, for at least a little while, has returned to Greystone Hall.